Welcome
What?
to The Poet's Voice, a series that runs on Black Moss Press. It's on our website. It's devoted to our writers talking about and reading their poems. Our mandate is to convey and emphasize how poetry is the perfect genre, maybe the perfect gesture for the 21st century. It is writing in smaller bites. It is a writing that captures the attention of readers. It causes them to ponder, maybe to think again, maybe to consider something they may never have thought. Today we have three writers from Black Moss who are going to do just that. All three have something in common, and that is the process of editing. I'd like you to meet Bruce Meyer. He's the author of a new book called Grace of Falling Stars. Antonia Faciaponte, the author of To Make a Bridge. And Michael Merola, the author of At the End of the World. Both Antonia and Michael's work were edited by Bruce Meyer, and Michael, for his part, has been Bruce's editor and publisher with Garnica Press. But Bruce's new book with Black Moss was edited by a lively editing team of interns. They dreamed up the title, and they decided which poem would go first. They were in charge, and Bruce will talk about that a little later. We're going to talk about the process, the editing process, the choices made, the ideas behind the ordering, maybe the selection of titles, the whole process of editing poetry, and what it was like for all three writers. So let's begin with you, Bruce. Bruce is one of the most prolific poets in Canada, maybe North America. He's published something like 66 books. He's someone who happens upon an idea for a book and 10 hours later emerges from his bunker in his house in Barrie with a full-fledged book, a completely new perspective on the subject that was entirely foreign to him before he ever started. So look him up. This Toronto-born poet, best-selling nonfiction writer, one-time CBC broadcast wonder, short story writer, teacher, and mentor to so many young writers, and maybe his only flaw, I'm sorry, Bruce, is that he still believes the Toronto Maple Leafs may have a chance at winning the Stanley Cup. Well, obviously not this year, anyway. Bruce, I wonder if you could begin briefly addressing what it was like to edit both Antonia's and Michael's poetry.
Well, in the case of Antonia's poetry, I've gotten to know Antonia because she was a student of mine at Victoria College in a number of courses, especially a double poetry course that I taught one year, a couple of years ago. And I watched her grow and emerge and so forth. And when it came time to edit her book, she gave me a stack of poems, and the poems didn't really have any shape. There wasn't anything I wanted to do to the individual poems, but there was a sense of shuffling them. And I believe in substantive editing. I think that at a certain point, editors have to learn to leave the actual text alone. But in Antonia's case, everything was there, but it just wasn't in the right order. So when we shuffled it, it turned into an opera, which is an interesting concept. In relation to Michael's work, Michael tends to give me books that are manuscripts that are everything's there. It's just a question of shuffling them and ordering them, and it's a question of putting things in some sort of order. So because the book itself, other than the individual parts of the book, but the book itself has to say something. And if you listen to what the poems are saying, what the stories are saying, they tell you what they want to become. And that was the experience with both Michael and Antonia. And my advice to editors is listen to what the work is trying to tell you, and it will eventually it will tell you what sort of shape it wants to take. So,
Thank you, Bruce. That was working with you. You've edited my work, and I've seen you've edited many of the authors at Black Moss, and you make such a wonder, make it look so easy, and you have insights that are quite amazing. So let me introduce you to Antonia. Antonia is a new writer on the literary scene in Canada. I mean, she has published in many different magazines, but this is her first book, To Make a Bridge. And as Bruce said, he described it as an opera, serious, but also an opera full of joy and life and at times humor. Even the writer Kate Marshall Flaherty said or described it as a second symphony, a cornucopia of culinary delights full of recipes for connecting families, generations, and cultures. And food, by the way, does figure into Antonia's writing. Antonia, perhaps you could begin with a poem.
Yes, I'm going to begin with the first poem in the collection. And as Bruce mentioned, it's structured like an opera, so this is the overture. It's titled Understanding. Standing under a bridge, you are blind, eyelids sutured over iris by the smooth, starless underbelly of infrastructure that protects perception from possibility, cages mischievous magpies of creativity in mud. An unknown lunar voice gleams like lamplight. Listen for the moon's monthly melody, serenading sheen across a cobblestone road. Its beam will beckon your vision's transgression. Climb atop the bridge to yowl obads that jailbreak into an upside-down verse of understanding.
Lovely, lovely.
Thank you.
I love that line, the upside down verse. I was reading that this morning, actually. I was really taken with your poetry, and when Bruce introduced it to me, I was so delighted. I'm wondering what the editorial process is like for you. You handed a manuscript, as Bruce said, a selection of poetry that I'm not sure whether it was fully formed, but I remember him calling me and telling me that in his hands he had an opera. I didn't quite know what to think of that. But I'm wondering what the process was like for you, and maybe what you learned about your writing, maybe what you learned about yourself as a poet.
Yeah, I did just hand Bruce a big stack of poems. I said, here's the manuscript. And I remember at the time, I was thinking to myself, this isn't horrible, the order that it's in, but looking back on it now, it was a huge chaotic mess. They had no form at all. And I remember after I handed Bruce the manuscript, a few days later, he called me and he said, there was an opera hidden in this book, in this stack of poems. And he had totally reordered them, and I was seeing them all anew again. And it was like I was reading a whole different book, seeing them in a different order. And I think what was amazing about this editing experience was that Bruce didn't just have, this opera structure in mind and kind of insert the poems into it. He found it in the poems. He listened to what the poems were saying, as he said before, and he looked to meaningfully shape them and bring out what was there. And it's that musical narrative that really holds together these Italian Canadian poems. When I look back at the way I had them ordered before, they were much more disjointed and not really resonating with each other. And I mean, I'm really big, I guess, on line by line editing because I've never had to organize a whole collection before, so this process, editing with Bruce, I found that I really learned a lot about like creating little imagistic and lyrical bridges between the poems, and thinking about how the collection overall moves, thinking about how to find my voice not only in a single poem but in many poems, because that's also part of the voice, how all the poems move together and work together.
I love that. It's so true. I teach a class in editing at the University of Windsor, and or even when I've taught creative writing, I tell the students that I'm kind of like a lifeguard, and I'm watching everybody in the water. And when you're in the water, you're swimming, you think you're doing everything right, but you don't have the global look. at what's happening actually in the water, and what direction you should be floating in. And Bruce, I think, has that ability. Whereas other people, and we experience this with Black Moss, we have other people who are better at the line editing and the copy editing, but they themselves can't see the overall picture. It's interesting. All right, thank you very much, Antonia, and we're going to come back to you. You're going to read some poems at the close. So let's move to Michael Merola. Michael is a Hamilton-based writer. He's written novels and plays, film scripts, short stories, and poetry collections. He describes his writing as a mix of magic realism, surrealism, speculative fiction, nonfiction. He was born in Italy, was raised in Montreal, and now makes his home in Hamilton. His newest book with Black Moss is called At the End of the World, and it was described by the writer Lawrence Hutchman as being a work of a daring and imaginative writer who takes us on journeys to places we've never been. And Hutchman also says that this book reveals Michael Merola as being at the summit of his poetic power. Michael, you are both a writer and an editor and a publisher of Guernica Press. Your book with Black Moss Press was edited by Bruce. I asked Antonia what her experience was like, but here you are, someone who is both a poet and an editor, and now having someone else look at your own work, someone who, in fact, Bruce Meyer, whose work you have edited. What was that like for you?